Welcome to the podcast. Súbele volumen. Conversation with the people who were with me. In the world of TV. Carlos tonight. Historias de un reportero. Carlos tonight. Dale que viene lo bueno.
Hey everyone, welcome to Carlos Tonight. Thank you so much for listening on your favorite podcast platform as well as for watching us. And it's always good to talk to a fellow journalist and a fellow podcaster. And I'm very excited to welcome Sandy Kaye, who is on the podcast. Hey Sandy, how are you?
Hello, Carlos. I'm great. I'm so excited to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. You're the host of A Breath of Fresh Air, and I love your show. And it's basically, for those of you who haven't listened to it, it's basically the soundtrack of your own life where you explore some of the best music from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And you talk to the artists behind the music. Tell us why this has become your passion project.
Yeah, it's quite a long story. I'm a journalist from years back, as you mentioned, and I think I kind of got stuck in my teenage years somewhere in terms of my musical taste. So all of the ones, I loved music. Well, who didn't love music when you were 14, 15, 18 years old, whatever you were? And of course, all that music is still very much around today. So I was doing entertainment reports for various radio stations before the pandemic, just as a bit of a sideline, because my main gig was as a corporate media trainer and presentation trainer, and that's how I made my money. And the pandemic came, and the stations that I was doing these live entertainment reports for said to me, "Oh, do you think there's any way you could blow out your reports, because a lot of our presenters are not coming in because of COVID?" So, okay, I always was one for a bit of a challenge. So I learned to build this, what was then a radio show, on my little laptop. And I built it according to the radio shows that I knew and loved. I've been a television reporter and a current affairs reporter. I've had my own radio shows. I've been a radio producer for some of the big names here in Australia. So I knew about putting a show together. And most of all, I know about research. I mean, I'm sure that you're in exactly the same boat, because that's one of our greatest skills. And in the days pre-internet, people would say, "But how do you go about finding people?" Well, we have our ways, don't we? So I was always very good, and I prided myself on being able to track down anybody anywhere in the world, even before you could Google them. So I thought, okay, I'll rise to this occasion and build this radio show, and I'll start reaching out to my favorite artists from when I was a teenager. And to my greatest surprise, many of them said yes. They were at home. They weren't on tour anywhere. They weren't making new music. They were caught in that vacuum that the pandemic gave us all. Yeah. And they said, yeah, we'll talk to you. So I was scoring some pretty big names in entertainment, well, in music particularly, through the United States, through Canada, through the UK, and of course here in Australia too. And that was the birth of A Breath of Fresh Air. It's been going probably a little on 2 years. How long has this pandemic been going? A little more than 2 years, I guess now. And I got to say, finding them now is getting a bit more difficult, because they're all out on tour and doing things and trying to make up for the time that they lost. But I'm still getting a whole lot of great names. And what I like most about my podcast is the ability to kind of get behind the bravado that these performers come with as a public face. So I don't know if anybody listening has heard A Breath of Fresh Air, but I think it's aptly named because you can kind of sit back and get behind not only the songs that they made that you know all the words to, but behind them as people. And I find it super interesting to hear about their musical journeys and their personal journeys too.
What is it about that era in music that means so much to you?
That's a really good question. I often ask myself that, and I think it's I think the time that we are most influenced by music is during our teenage years when we're growing. I mean, I remember, being at school, and before we started off our school day, we would all gather in groups and put the music on loud and sing it all together and gee ourselves up for the daily grind of school, right? Or, when you'd go dating with boys for the first time and you'd hear music in their cars, or you'd have your first kiss, all that sort of stuff. And the music just takes you back to those days.
Yeah.
But I also think that the music, particularly of the 70s, and I guess that's really that was my heyday. I do take in this podcast the music of the 60s because that was so formative, and the 80s on the other side, which I don't think is quite as good as the 70s. But the 70s was such a revolutionary time for music. Everybody was out there. It was so creative. And a lot of the musicians that are there today look back on their days of making music, and many of them are still making music today, and say, oh no, the 70s were the heyday. We'd come out of the 60s and the whole Vietnam War thing, and it was all burn your bra and women's lib and all that happening. And the 70s, we weren't hippies anymore. I was too young to actually have been a hippie, but growing up through the 70s, we were just free. There were no wars going on. Everyone was happy. It was all about just making ourselves, making fun, having fun. There was nothing else you had to worry about. You'd sneak out from under your parents' clothes and you just go and party wherever you could. There weren't, there were drugs around, of course, but not as heavy as drugs as there are today. It was just a great time to be living and playing and growing up through.
Had a great time, right?
Yeah, we had it all.
Was there, when you were creating your podcast, was there an artist that was like top of the list that you wanted to interview? And when that actually happened, what was that like?
All right, let me take you a step back. When I was about 9 years old, people often say to me, did you always want to interview people? Did you always want to be a journalist? And I guess this story kind of portrays it best. When I was about 9 years old, my parents would go out on a Sunday afternoon. I'm not sure why they would leave me at home with he was then 4-year-old brother. Mm-hmm. I was the babysitter. But they'd go out and I would rearrange all of the sofas in the living room. And my mother had this single long-stemmed vase for a rose. It was blue china, and that was my microphone. And on the sofas, I would assemble my favorite artists. I mean, you're too young, Carlos, to remember, but maybe some of the listeners will remember the Dinah Shore Show. She was a super famous interviewer in the States, I think predominantly through the 60s. And of course, Australia, we were taking all the best television from the United States as well as the United Kingdom at the time. So I just wanted to be Dinah Shore. I wanted to talk to all the people she talked to. And at 9 years of age, I had my imaginary people on the couch. So I would interview Elvis, and I would interview a little bit later, the Monkees came along, and I would interview Muhammad Ali. And anybody I could think of, every Sunday was interview day. Mm-hmm. I didn't think too much about that until later years. And as a young radio reporter in Sydney, in New South Wales, here in Australia, I was sent on a job one day because Muhammad Ali was coming to Sydney. This was in the days when he was really well and at the peak of his career. And I put my hand up. I said, I'm going to talk to Muhammad Ali. Absolutely, it's me.
Yeah.
So, they sent me out with my little recorder. I think it might have even been a cassette recorder. It was a cassette recorder at the time. It was that long ago. And we went to the hotel where he was going to address the waiting media. And he was taking so long to come there, and everybody was just sitting, chatting. And I grew very restless. And I said to my buddy, who was at that time reporting for our version of 60 Minutes, I said, come on, let's go and find his room. He said, okay. I can't remember how we found the room in this hotel. I do remember knocking on the door, and the big man opened the door and he said, you go, you stay. And Michael, my friend, had to walk away with his tail between his legs, and I was in there with my tape recorder. And for the next 2 hours, I sat with Muhammad Ali going, what do you think about this? And what do you think about that? And I don't know if you've ever heard any of those dissertations that Muhammad Ali used to do. He gave me, and I only just discovered the cassette not very long ago.
Oh, wow.
I've still got it. He gave me a whole monologue on motivation by Muhammad Ali.
Wow.
It is incredible. I mean, apart from that, he also did all of these station IDs for me, I'm Muhammad Ali, you're listening to 2WS radio, I was the star of the day.
I bet, yeah.
So he was one of the guys that I had interviewed as a 9-year-old on my imaginary guest on my couch. And there I was as a 20-year-old, really spending a long time with him. And we became quite friendly after that, because he then traveled to Melbourne sometime later, and I caught up with him again. And he was fabulous. He was just brilliant. I mean, he doesn't actually fit into my musical category at all, but he certainly fits into my hero category.
Yeah. Oh, okay. What a great segue, because I was going to ask you, because as journalists, we talk to pretty much everyone. Has there been a time where you were starstruck at someone? I know doing the podcast, I had interviewed Jono. He's a celebrity trainer out there where you are. And when I first started talking to him, I was just kind of like nervous and like, oh, I can't believe I'm talking to you. I follow you on social media. Now you're right here on my show. So has there anyone been there for you like that?
Yeah. Mickey Dolenz from the Monkees got me.
Oh, I love it.
Got me good. Again, they've been on my couch as a 9-year-old. And as I grew through my teen years, I was, monkey mad, like so many other girls. Well, particularly girls, but boys too, for sure. So I hadn't had the opportunity of meeting them before. And when I got to speak to Mickey in the very early days of my podcast, I was like, I could not believe I turned into that 14-year-old again. It was ridiculous.
It happens, right?
I got off the phone, and my partner, who's also a journalist, was staring at me. He said, "What the hell are you doing?" I said, "You don't understand. It was Mickey. That's Mickey from the Monkees." And he said, "You're crazy." I said, "But I was like bright red in the face, and I was 14 again. What can I tell you?" It was Mickey. He did it to me.
Wow,
yeah.
What an amazing story. So when talking to these artists, what do you think they have all in common?
Passion. They all love the music. They live for the music. They've all been completely broke to start off with until they started to make money. They all lament the old days of not only the music taking the front seat to everybody's lives, but also paying the dollars.
Yeah.
That they all say that the whole modern way of making money from music, the licensing just sucks for them, and the only way they can make money is getting on the road. And of course, many of the guys that I speak to these days, they're all in their 70s and some of them in their 80s. And it's really difficult for them to travel these days. It's difficult for younger people to travel these days, as you'd well know. But if you're dependent upon making your living now by traveling from city to city, and you can't do it quite as fast or as much as you used to do, then it becomes a little more difficult. So I find that they all have that in common also. A lot of them try and put on a front and say, oh no, look, we still love performing in front of an audience, and that's the best way of connecting. And and audiences obviously love seeing them live too. The other thing I think that they all have in common is trying to stay relevant, instead of not simply being a nostalgia act. And many of them are still making music today, which is really great to see. I spoke with Graham Nash from Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young just a few weeks ago, and he's got a new album out, which is awesome. so he says his creativity is still burning as bright today as it was 50 years ago. But also what he can't believe, and a lot of them express same, is that the songs that they wrote 50 years ago, many of them war protest songs or environmental songs, that sort of stuff, are still so relevant today that the world really hasn't learnt very much at all, as we know.
Yeah.
And the relevance is amazing. When you listen to the lyrics that they wrote 50 years ago, it was almost like they were prophetic.
Yeah.
And none of them knew that, of course, they didn't know that their
Right.
songs or their careers would have such longevity.
And some of them have really powerful lyrics.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
when you were listening to the music back then, and then you're getting to hear, how the music all was created, do you ever relate to any of the artists and how they started?
How do you mean?
Like, say you're listening to, I don't know, the Monkees, let's say, since we were just talking about them, and talking to the artists and getting to know the backstory of how a song was developed. Do you often relate to how it all started, how it was put together?
For them?
For them, yeah.
Well, I mean, growing up and listening to the music, I never spared a thought for what went on for the artist behind that music. So for me, it's a real education these days to go, that's why you thought of that song. Oh, that's what those lyrics mean. Had no idea. For instance, there was a song by a Canadian man called Five Man Electrical Band, and the song was Signs. I don't know if you know that one. It was a big hit in the States. But, he was telling me that they were driving through America on one highway somewhere for the first time when they got a gig, when they were able to cross the border from Canada because they were invited to play in the States. And he was just totally struck by the number of signs. Don't do this, cross here, slow down there, all the signage coming at him. And that's what he wrote this song about. And, as a teenager, I know all the words to that song, but I had no idea that that's what he was writing about. And there are a ton of songs like that I'd never spared a thought for what those words actually mean. And it's funny because some of the artists say to me also that, I said, what were you writing about? Oh, nothing. I thought, what do you mean nothing? It was like such an important song to me. It was my first kiss, or it was my first date, or the first time I held a hand with a boy, or whatever. What were you writing? No, nothing. For many of them, they talk about the songs dropping like manna from heaven into their lap, that they have to do nothing to get this at all, other than be aware that the words are there or the musicality is there, and they have to quickly write it down. I had never, ever heard of that before. I didn't know that songwriting was like that. Who did I speak to the other day? Oh, Graham Gouldman from 10cc. He's written tons of songs for bands like the Hollies, for too many to even mention, but I'm most well known for the band 10cc. And some of those songs also, I said to him, what were you writing about? Oh, nothing. It just came to me. It just came to me. He said, what do you mean it just came to you? How does that happen? I guess you have to be really lucky for it to happen, for it to drop into your lap.
Right.
And then it turns to be a song. He said, it's interesting that I hear from many fans that it becomes so important to them. It takes on so much meaning for the people who listen to it. But for me, it actually didn't have any meaning at all. So it's kind of disappointing in a way that there wasn't all this profound thought that went into some of these songs, that they're just gifts from I don't know where.
That's great insight. Are there other things that kind of surprise you when you talk to these artists?
Yeah, kind of the bigger the artist, the more down to earth they are. That's kind of surprising too. I reached out, as I said, to some of my heroes, and many of them were so lovely. I have to say, Gordon Lightfoot was one of my I really liked Gordon Lightfoot's music a lot. Again, I came to him late. He started off before my time, but I was really keen on getting an interview with him. And Gordon Lightfoot's now 83 years old, and it was kind of like talking to somebody's grandfather with their hearing aid out.
Yeah.
It was I think that was probably the worst interview I've ever had to do, and it was so disappointing because he had great stories to tell, but it was really difficult pulling them out of him. Somebody like Dion DiMucci, on the other hand, who's the same age, is young and vital and so energetic at 83 and making the amazing new music. He lives in Florida and he's, doing music with Springsteen and a whole lot of other people. He's almost at the peak of his career now, and he'd started way back in the 50s. What I can't believe is that these guys who started when they were often teenagers themselves, even sometimes before they were teenagers, they started playing music and they had decided that that's their passion and that's what they want to do. I'm amazed at how passionate they are still about it 50, sometimes 60 years later. They've given their entire lives to music and to making other people happy. Yeah.
It's beautiful. What do you think you're learning about yourself through your show and talking to these artists?
Well, that's a really good question. I think I learned that I'm not as good an interviewer as I thought I was. As you started off saying, as journalists, we have to be good at talking to all sorts of people, whether it's the guy picking up the garbage outside, right up to the Queen of England, who I didn't actually get to speak to also.
Oh, yeah.
And everybody in between. And the most important quality about being an interviewer, and I'm sure you'll agree, is A, curiosity, and B, your ability to listen. So as time goes on and I'm speaking, I've spoken to, I don't know, hundreds, if not thousands of these guys already. I'm going to have to run out soon because many of them are already passing over, and some of the ones I've spoken to are no longer here anymore either. I'm still very curious about them, but a lot of the stories are now starting to be a little bit same.
Yeah.
And what I'm learning about myself is that I have to dig a little bit deeper to really get the differences out, because it's kind of easy to just ask the same old questions, and then I'm starting to get the same old answers every interview, and then the interviews are the same, doesn't matter who I'm speaking to. So I'm trying to find now different ways to elicit different responses, different parts of them. And they're all very forthcoming. I can get quite deep and meaningful and intimate with them in ways that I think somebody less trained perhaps wouldn't be able to. Well, firstly, I'm not sure that they'd be able to get them in the first place.
Yeah.
But I tend to make friends with them, and I'm desperately waiting for the Australian dollar to go back up against the US dollar so I can travel again, because I've got appointments everywhere with some of these guys that I would love to meet in person, not just over a screen.
Oh, for
So
sure.
I'm learning. I'm not quite as good as I thought I was. I'm learning that I have to do things a little bit differently. You can't just rest on your laurels and do it the same way each time. And I think I'm learning to like 80s music a little bit more than I ever did.
I got you. Do you have any future plans on taking any of those interviews and maybe putting them in a book?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that. I saw a publisher in Norway that I know has actually just published a book of a music journalist with several interviews. And I thought when I finish doing this, that's probably exactly what I'll do, because the stories are phenomenal. And then I'll travel the road and get first-hand photos of them all too before they all go. But you know what happened to me? I have to share something with you, Carlos. You'll be able to relate. For the last, I've been doing these interviews before it was even a podcast. as I said, it was a radio show. And before it was a radio show, it was part of my entertainment reports, and I'd just be using grabs or snippets of these interviews for radio broadcast. And I'd been storing everything on an external hard drive. I hadn't been backing it up to the cloud, only on the external hard drive. I had a 2 terabyte hard drive that contains 2 years worth of radio shows and raw interviews. And a few weeks ago, the hard drive failed.
Oh, no.
And it continued to fail. And it's one of those Seagate ones. Anyway, a very nice young man who works for Seagate, for Lacey, who resides in Costa Rica, helped me out and said, look, we'll extend your warranty and you'll have to send the hard drive off to our headquarters to go to the lab in the Netherlands. So very reluctantly, I've sent this entire library of all my interviews for them to try and retrieve the data. I'll keep you posted whether they actually manage to. I won't have it back for at least a month or more.
Oh, yeah.
But if they can't retrieve the data, then all my hopes for doing a book are dashed. And in fact, I think I've decided that if they can't retrieve that data, I think that's a sign that I'll get my life back.
Well, I'll keep my fingers crossed and say a little prayer.
I'll let you know.
Wow, okay. And by the way, I wore this shirt, Selena shirt from the Grammys for this interview.
That's awesome. Because, of course, you don't specialize in music, do you? You talk to people all over the place.
Yeah, all walks of life. We got actors, we've got personal trainers, producers, writers, everyone.
Oh, it keeps it interesting. Who's your favourite musical star? Because what I do with my listeners too, and I think what makes A Breath of Fresh Air unique, is that I always ask listeners to write into me and request a guest. Tell me who you want to hear from the 60s, 70s and 80s. I'm following my nose and the guests that I liked. But if you've got a special one that you'd like to hear from, let me know. And people are writing to me from everywhere, asking me. I had a request from Nick Kershaw in the UK, for Roy Wood from ELO, for Wayne Nelson from Little River Band. I'm getting them from everywhere. For Steve Winwood, I'd like to dedicate a request to you, Carlos. I'll put you on.
I think the person that I think of when you're talking just now is Carlos Santana.
Got it. I shall write it down. I'll chase him up. He hasn't been in very good health of late.
Yeah.
But I will he's doing I know he's doing a Las Vegas residency at the moment. Mm-hmm. I will reach out to him and if I can get him, then I'm going to put Carlos on with Carlos on A Breath of Fresh Air.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you so much. I love that.
That would be good. And anybody who's listening, if you would like to request a guest on A Breath of Fresh Air, just send me a message through that website, abreathofreshair.com.au. You have to put the AU because I'm in Australia. Mm-hmm. So AU is for Australia.
Perfect. And I will put that in the show notes so people will know and connect with you and talk with you. Sandy Kaye, host of A Breath of Fresh Air. Thank you for being here and continued success. God bless you.
Thank you so much for having me, Carlos. A real pleasure.
And that's all the time we have. Thanks so much for watching and for listening to this episode of Carlos Tonight. It was written and produced by yours truly, Carlos Correa. My theme by Sken, Galis. And you can check out my website, carlostonight.com, where you can find the latest on the podcast, see upcoming guests, and check out past episodes. That's carlostonight.com.